Chapter 1 Heaven 21st of Sidra, 346 AG. He fell. The wind blew his hair in all directions and buffeted his ears. It was not painful or necessarily scary. In fact, it was exhilarating. For a moment, he was in awe of the sensation of flight. He felt free like a bird and considered spreading his arms and flying far away from everything he had ever known. He entertained a dream of building something new for himself. A life rooted in peace and comfort passed through his mind. He imagined trading in his sword for a hoe and fantasized over tilling the ground of his cabbage farm. The thought was peaceful, but it could never happen, for Crinnan Jamiso was dead. The world beneath him grew smaller, and Crinnan realized he wasn't plummeting towards it or flying like he had thought. He had no control over his body. He could fly nowhere. He could do nothing as he rapidly ascended away from the orange, green, and blue planet beneath him. His body was climbing into the clouds as if some celestial fisherman had hooked him and was reeling him in. The darkness of night that had surrounded him was gone. The growling of his attackers and the pain that they had induced was nothing more than a memory. Crinnan's arms flailed as he floated upward, or at least he thought they did. When he searched for his body, he found nothing. Out of all the strange variables of his situation, that was what led him to panic. Crinnan passed through the clouds, or what he perceived were the clouds, and was engulfed in the brilliant light of the brothers, the twin suns that hung in the heavens above Dura'ana. The sudden brightness blinded him for a moment, but his vision soon adjusted. He felt a comforting feeling of warmth spread over him, even though he could not find his body. Crinnan was quickly learning that he was no longer a physical being. He was, in fact, nothing more than his thoughts. Crinnan tried to clear his mind and figure out what was happening to him. He had trouble getting his thoughts in order, so he started with the basics to ground himself. He was a scout-class knight in the elite century squad of Black Knight. He favored the sword and pistol in combat. He had 2 friends, Alec and Alia, and the last thing he had eaten was beans. "Beans," Crinnan whispered as he ascended. "Yes." The events of his final night on the planet started streaming in. He remembered he had been sent by his sergeant, Caven Priest, to scout the area surrounding their camp. Sentry Squad had stopped in the Isla Oxy caverns west of the Belhazi Weld to rest. Their mission had been to gather intel on a radio tower that had recently been constructed south of the Great Kanrushi Canyon. It was supposedly powerful enough to give the Govian Empire communications abilities throughout the entirety of the country of Isla Oxy. Sentry Squad's mission was to observe the construction from afar and determine whether they were going to be able to destroy it. Crinnan had been sent with his squad mates, Jeff Skaven and Pancho Lopez, to make sure their area of the great ancient forest city was secure. He remembered walking through the darkness of the Belhazi Weld, flashlight in hand and a cigarette hanging from his mouth. He recalled it all to near perfection. His memory had become as vivid as if he were watching himself on television. He saw the ambush, something that Crinnan was prone to due to himself constantly getting lost in thought. He watched the monsters leap from the trees and eviscerate him. He watched his guts fall from his stomach as he was gored, and finally witnessed the life drain from his eyes. There was no time for him to fight back before he had been slain, and his corpse was dragged away for dinner by the monsters who had killed him. "No!" he fearfully whispered as his ascent suddenly slowed. A shock of terror coursed through his body like lightning through his veins. He realized he had been killed. He had failed to defend himself, and the monsters were probably feasting on his guts at that very moment. Yet there he was, somehow conscious and able to think about it. What truly frightened him, however, was the sudden reality that filled his mind. Crinnan realized what was coming next. He had heard stories about it his entire life. He had been warned by the followers of Dura'ana, the ungrateful citizens whom Crinnan and the rest of Black Knight fought endlessly to liberate from their government. They warned him. They had pleaded with him to turn away from his life of sin and defiance and embrace the ways of Dura'ana, but he turned them all away. They had warned him, and Crinnan had ignored them. An eternity of everlasting pain and torture awaited him. Crinnan Jamiso's reward for his defiance was the hells. 23 years was all he had. 23 years of living, breathing, eating, drinking, fucking, fighting, and shitting it all back out. As he floated above the clouds of his home and stared into the brother's light, he flirted with the idea that it had all been in vain. He pondered over whether his life had been wasted or not. He contemplated whether he had been a failure. Had he been nothing more than a damned tool in a war that had only led him to his death? Had he been used? The realization of how worthless his life had been led him to beg for his tears to fall. Yet Crinnan had no eyes to cry from. "Fuck!" he shouted as he stared into the light of the brothers. It was the only word he could manage to spit out. Crinnan had always been a person of few words, more so the type who communicated with glares, sneers, sucker punches, and grunts. The single word wasn't, however, an attempt to communicate. It was simply the manifestation of everything he felt inside him. "Are you real?" he called out as he nervously looked around. "Hello? I know you're there. Come on, show yourself. Let's get this over with." A brilliant white light, brighter even than the brothers themselves, suddenly and silently exploded from what would have been the center of his body. For a moment, everything was swallowed by the light, and he was blinded. He couldn't see anything around him, but he could feel something. Everything was silent, and it was unnerving for Crinnan. In his short life, he had grown accustomed to noise, be it the wind, gunfire, or even the ever-present pulsing of his heart. When his vision finally slowly faded back in, he found that he was no longer a floating nothing. His body had been returned to him, and the sensation of being physical manifested a shocked gasp. Crinnan immediately looked down at his hands. They were the same hands he had used his entire life. He saw the freckle on the side of his left hand, the pattern his veins made underneath his skin. He saw hair creeping up the sides, the dozens of scars from training and combat. Seeing it all again stirred up a strange and foreign barrage of feelings that he wasn't prepared for. He was completely naked and stood alone on a crystal-clear glass floor, surrounded by a radiant white light. Far beneath his bare feet, Crinnan saw the planet of Dura'ana. It was where he had grown up, fought, and ultimately died. From where he stood, it looked calm and peaceful. It was all a lie, for Dura'ana had never known peace. Crinnan looked up and marveled at the magnificent gleaming skyline of what he perceived was the city of eternal paradise. It was heaven, and he knew that this glimpse was the divine tormenting him. The goddess Dura'ana was dangling Zion just out of reach of Crinnan's grasp. She was showing him what he could have obtained had he submitted in life. In all her grace and love, the bitch rewarded a being who had suffered immensely in life with one single step upon the outskirts of salvation. Crinnan felt the divine presence again, and he knew that he was no longer alone. "I guess this is it," he whispered with a defeated tone. His fists clenched and his heart thumped rapidly. Sweat lined his hairline, and he took a deep, sorrowful breath. He was fearful of looking up because he knew exactly who stood before him. "And I guess you are."
"I am."
The voice that cut him off was both a whisper and a chorus, the manifestation of salvation and damnation in one. It was beautiful and at the same time terrifying.
Dura'ana.
The physical force and immeasurable energy behind her gently spoken words was more than Crinnan could bear. It hit him like a mighty wind, tinged with the most infernal heat he had ever felt, and then a biting cold the likes of which he couldn't have fathomed in life. Crinnan felt an immense pressure on his shoulders, and his knees buckled. He fell to the glassy floor, prostrated before the goddess. It wasn't out of reverence or duty. It was simply his body's natural reaction to something far beyond himself, a response that he had no control over. The form of a female adorned in a flowing white dress stood before him. Her glossy black hair reflected the light around her, and the fabric of her spectral clothing seemed to defy the laws of gravity as it floated all around her. Her face, beautiful he imagined, remained hidden behind the same white light that had previously blinded him. Or, Crinnan surmised, perhaps the light was her face. Dura'ana stood in silence before Crinnan. He could feel her hidden gaze piercing him. She dissected and analyzed him. It felt like layers of his mind were being filleted and studied, and an immense clamping pressure formed in his skull. Crinnan groaned and tried to move, tried to find any kind of comfort, but there was none for him. Heaven was only the beginning of Crinnan's damnation, and there was nothing he could do about it. Clenched tightly in the goddess's right hand was the handle of a long, gleaming, gold-bladed sword. Crinnan recalled its name being Eska. It was an ancient Damarsi word that meant justice in the modern tongue. In her left hand was a thick book, Sophie Groud, or the Book of Mercy, as it was called by her followers. The book swung open, and Dura'ana looked down at it.
Crinnan Jamiso,
she whispered. Her voice was melodic like a chorus of angels. Crinnan only allowed himself a moment to marvel, though, for she was not his goddess.
a child with such powerful lineage. Your ancestors hewed the history of Dura'ana with their blood. My child, why did you deny me in life?
Just do it, Crinnan painfully whispered. His entire body was tense, and his fists were clenched with fear and fury. I'm here, so you got what you wanted out of me. I'm not afraid. Do what you do.
You are afraid, child.
Dura'ana corrected him.
You killed those that loved me in life, and you curse me in death. Did my people fail you so? Tell me, Crinnan. Give me a reason to spare you.
Crinnan couldn't think. He couldn't figure out what to say. I am afraid.
Afraid of me?
Dura'ana asked.
Or are you afraid of the fate you have earned for yourself?
It doesn't matter, Crinnan whispered as he lowered his head. I'm damned no matter what I say here.
You speak truth,
Dura'ana replied.
My child, I'm sorry, but I gave you an entire life to make the right choice. You simply didn't.
Just get it over with, then, Crinnan mumbled, his head still lowered. Send me to the hells.
Very well,
Dura'ana said. At that, the brothers' light was blotted out, and day turned to night. The Book of Mercy in Dura'ana's left hand crumbled to dust and blew away with the wind.
I sentence you to 2,000 years in the hells,
she declared, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone.
And then you shall be judged as to whether you may labor in the fields of heaven. May you find peace, child.
The goddess raised Eska, the sword, in her right hand and pointed the tip at Crinnan. The ground suddenly trembled, and tendrils of darkness violently pierced the crystalline floor, embedding transparent shards of whatever heaven was made of into Crinnan's flesh. The shadow vines began creeping toward Crinnan from all directions, closing in on his body. He watched his fate approach him, and his heart pounded. yet he did not move. He was consoled only by knowing that he was about to embrace the same destiny that every Black Knight that preceded him had, that he had earned his place in the Hells. The tendrils quickly took hold of Crinnan and wrapped themselves around his wrists and ankles, lifting and stretching his body. Dura'ana reduced in size so that the two of them stood eye to eye, and with gentle steps she approached him. The light that had enveloped the goddess's face turned to a dark haze, and her white dress transmogrified into a glowing black tattered robe. A hood raised over her black hair, and the golden blade ignited in flame. Crinnan squinted his eyes as the goddess approached. He would not turn away. He would face his fate with every ounce of strength he had amassed back in his life. Without another word on her part, Dura'ana's eyes suddenly burned red, piercing the dark haze that enveloped her face. She threw her head back and released a planet-shattering wail. Crinnan's attention was drawn to the skyline of heaven behind him. The gleaming, beautiful spires of eternal bliss exploded and crumpled. A mighty wave of energy was released, soaring past him and buffeting his body with the dust and shards of what could have been his paradise. He watched all hope of comfort and peace vanish before his eyes. The tendrils tightened on his limbs, and Dura'ana leveled her gaze on him. After a few silent moments, the goddess raised the sword and planted it to the hilt into Crinnan's chest. He gasped, and the black tendrils suddenly enveloped his entire body. He couldn't help himself as he struggled and fought as they wrapped around every inch of him. Panic ensued, and as the vines wrapped around his throat, he began to feel claustrophobic. The last image Crinnan saw before his eyes were covered in thick black darkness was that of Dura'ana turning her back to him.
I never knew you,
she whispered with a sad tone. Then there was nothing. Heaven vanished, and Crinnan once again saw the planet far beneath him. The wind tore at his skin as he plummeted from a height he could never have fathomed on his own. He watched as the world grew bigger and closer, felt the vines tear into his skin like leeches, and tried to scream, but he could not. Instead, he gritted his teeth and flared his nostrils as the planet drew nearer. Crinnan's body finally struck the solid ground, and the world seemed to shatter like glass. The shards of Dura'ana tore through his skin and left jagged splinters all through him. What wasn't shredded by the glass was ripped apart as Crinnan passed through layer after layer of the rock. His speed did not decrease, friction did not slow him. The glassy, jagged underworld took every bit of flesh it could. Eventually, Crinnan broke through the final layer of the world, and it opened up, swallowing the once proud Black Knight. Crinnan, who was nothing more than bone and blood at that point, burst into a world-sized chasm of darkness. Had the ground not been engulfed in flame, the new world would have been nothing but blackness. Crinnan's bones passed through wave after wave of thick smoke, and he began to hear the roaring and crackling of the fire beneath him. He smelled the cooking flesh and heard ear-piercing screaming. The jubilant whooping and maniacal laughter of the demons below was terrifying. A realization quickly struck home, and Crinnan felt more fear overcome the skeleton of a body that was left of him. He had entered the Hells. The sound of solemn organ music could be heard, faintly at first, accompanied by the voices of a chorus. They sang in an ancient language, one he did not understand. As he drew nearer and nearer to the burning ground, the tempo and volume increased to a point where it sounded like the chorus was screaming as they foretold his doom. Fear enveloped him. He did not know what was going on, but when he was nearly 100 feet from the ground somehow, something flashed before him. It was a sentence spelled out in red glowing letters, and it seemed to float in the air above him, no matter where he looked.
You have died.